The year is 1565, and in Spanish Florida, the first New World is taking shape.
It's really only recently that the general public has been made aware that St. Augustine precedes Plymouth Rock and Jamestown.
One of the features of 16th century Florida that is becoming increasingly clear as I do research in archives in Spain and other parts of the world is the critical role that Africans have played in the historical foundation of Spanish Florida.
The New World was built by three groups: the Europeans, the Indigenous, and the Africanos. And that without any of those three, this would not have happened.
All of the colonists that came here in 1565 were investors in the enterprise of Florida. There was sweat equity, there was blood equity, but also they all had a monetary investment in this. So your Africans here as free men were here just like any other colonists anywhere else in the world. They were trying to make a better place for themselves. And in that, they were all working toward a common goal.
Free blacks became shopkeepers and merchants and skilled artisans and craftsmen. In other words, what makes the colony function? And they perform many of the tasks that you see Spaniards performing or Portuguese performing. They own property. And often you have examples of free blacks owning property in areas, parts of town, very close to the plaza, that were not simply limited to the colonial white elite.
There is a baptism of a free black child in St. Augustine 3 years before Jamestown is even founded. The King of Spain created the Edict of 1693, which to my knowledge and other scholars appears to be the first civil rights legislation in the New World. It stated that if you were enslaved on an English plantation, if you could make it to Spanish territory, that you would be given your freedom, with the provision that you join the militia, became Catholic, and provided some service.
Governor Montellano, who was the governor of Spanish Florida at that time, decreed that any freedom seekers that ran away from the Carolinas and the runaway slaves that made their way down from the Carolinas to Spanish Florida would obtain their freedom and would be able to live free at Fort Mose.
It is a part of U.S. history that's just not well known. The first underground railroad runs south. It runs south to St. Augustine, not north.
How do people on a plantation hear that you can find freedom in Spanish Florida?
It would kind of start out like, if you hear in the background there's some music, maybe some drums playing, and the tune would be Steal Away, and that would be a signal that they would need to steal away to Fort Mose.
It might help or it might not matter to you that from Charleston to St. Augustine is 377 miles.
In the Carolinas, or Georgia, or as far north as New York, we have runaway slaves from Virginia and New York trying to make their way to St. Augustine, really beginning at the end of the 17th century and then in earnest in the 18th century.
This was a story not about slavery, but that the Fort Mose story is a story about freedom.
Little Africa was a community of newly freed blacks that settled in St. Augustine, Florida after the Civil War. Although they were skilled farmers, high rates of illiteracy would surely condemn them and their children to a life of hard poverty. Ending this would require outside help.
We came in 1866 at the request of Bishop Augustin Varro. He asked for 8 sisters that would come. They had about 160 that volunteered, but the General Superior had already selected about 8 sisters that would come. And their ages ranged really probably from about 45 to probably 19, 20 years old. And he made it very clear that they were coming to teach the liberated slaves, that would be their work here. When they started to teach here, they taught children, you know, and only boys came to school originally. But it wasn't too many weeks later, though, that the little girls started to come too. The parents would send the children, and at night we taught the adults.
Despite their good works, it wasn't long before the sisters were caught in the rising tide of racial segregation.
It was illegal to teach black people. The black people didn't get a fair shake at all because they were black, and were still considered as slaves by many people and treated that way too. So there was a lot of animosity about, you know, educating black people, even after the Civil War, even after they were freed. In 1916, 3 of our sisters were arrested, and it was on Easter Sunday, and they were arrested over at St. Benedict's. The sisters were over there probably for Sunday school, after church services. The order to arrest them probably came from the governor, who was very anti-Catholic. So that went on for a week or two, but the end result was that that law was lifted from the books.
Built in the 1870s by freed St. Augustine slaves, Lincolnville was the epitome of American middle-class family values. But a growing storm of racial hatred and injustice was about to change Lincolnville's destiny.
By the end of 1963, St. Augustine was rapidly developing national recognition as Florida's Birmingham.
St. Augustine's middle-class blacks were pressured to stay out of the fight.
My father was a teacher, and he was told that if he was participating in the movement, he'd lose his job.
There needed to be a new front opened in the fight against segregation. Leading this fight would be former Air Force Lieutenant and Lincolnville dentist, Dr. Robert Haling. Haling organized local youths and began sending them into local whites-only restaurants. On a hot July day in 1963, 14-year-old Samuel White, 15-year-old Audrey Nell Edwards, 16-year-old Willie Carl Singleton, and 16-year-old Joanne Anderson went up to the Woolworth's lunch counter and tried to order a hamburger and a Coke. They were arrested and later sentenced to 1 year in reform school. This harsh sentencing of peaceful children drew local and national outrage, but this was only the beginning.
The scariest night was when the Klans and the others were down in the slave market. They had brought in a truckload of rocks and put it in the slave market so they would have to throw at us.
Outrage overcame fear, and Lincolnville remained silent no more.
The people at Howard Johnson's, the cooks, the people who cleaned the rooms, they stood up for the people in this particular struggle. They said, you know what, if I lose my job, I'd rather lose my job than go for another day where somebody I know can be bricked or stoned.
The year is 1964, and protests have reached a fever pitch in St. Augustine.
By the end of May, it was apparent that national Negro organizations had selected St. Augustine as a target city for racial demonstrations.
St. Augustine, or Birmingham, or Little Rock, is merely a symbol or an expression of the tragedies that engulf our whole nation in the area of race relations.
On June 18th, SCLC associate J.T. Johnson hatched a plan at the Monson Motor Lodge. The Monson was the site of frequent protests. Hotel manager James Brock was all too willing to have protesters jailed. JT's plan was simple. He asked a friend of the cause, Al Lingo, to check into the hotel. Because Al was white, there were no problems at the front desk. Al then jumped into the hotel pool. JT Johnson and several others joined him. Moments later, an enraged James Brock emerged and began pouring muriatic acid pool cleaner into the pool and on the swimmers. This act of wanton hate made headlines around the world and shook the halls of power.
Our whole foreign policy and everything else go to hell over this. Yesterday in the swimming pool in St. Augustine, they jumped in and police jumped in, their clothes on, they started pouring acid in the pool. I saw that on television.
And then, a mere 2 weeks later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law.
The purpose of this law is simple. It does not restrict the freedom of any American. It does say that there are those who are equal before God shall now also be equal in the polling booths, in the classrooms, in the factories, and in hotels and restaurants and movie theaters and other places that provide service to the public.